My name is Andrew Morrison, and at 72 years old, I never thought I'd be standing alone on the sidewalk outside what used to be my family home. For 40 years, I built a life with my beloved wife, Eleanor, raising our son with love and sacrifice. When Eleanor died, my world crumbled twice. First losing her, then discovering our son Jacob and his wife Tiffany saw me as nothing but a burden, a financial parasite they wanted gone. Little did they know, I had one final lesson to teach them both. Before I tell you this story, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from, and hit that subscribe button to support more stories of family betrayal and sweet, well-deserved justice. I was born into a working-class family in a small town in Ohio. My father worked at the local factory, and my mother was a school teacher. They taught me the value of hard work and perseverance from a young age. By the time I was 16, I was working summers helping a local contractor, learning the construction trade from the ground up. After high school, I managed to get into a state college with a partial scholarship and weekend jobs to cover the rest. That's where I met Eleanor Williams, a bright-eyed English major with a laugh that could light up any room. We were both working at the campus cafeteria, trying to make ends meet. I still remember the day I first saw her, dropping a tray of dishes because I was so distracted by her smile. "Need some help there?" she'd asked, kneeling down to help me pick up the broken pieces. From that moment, we were inseparable. We dated through college, sharing dreams over coffee in cheap diners, planning a future neither of us was sure we could afford but determined to build together. When we graduated, I proposed with a ring that cost me 3 months of savings, but Eleanor said it was perfect. We started our life together in a one-bedroom apartment with furniture from thrift stores. I worked for a construction company while taking night classes in business management. Eleanor taught at a local high school. We saved every penny we could, living by a simple philosophy: spend on what matters, save for tomorrow, and value people over possessions. By the time I was 30, I had learned enough about construction and business to start my own small company. Morrison Construction began with just me and 2 other workers, taking on renovation projects that bigger companies overlooked. Eleanor would help with the books at night, after grading papers. It was hard work, with long hours and uncertain paydays, but we were building something together. 10 years into our marriage, we were blessed with our son Jacob. Eleanor cut back on teaching to care for him while I expanded the business. By then, we had moved to a modest 3-bedroom house in a nice neighborhood. Nothing fancy, but it was ours, and we were proud of it. The mortgage was manageable, and we continued our habit of living below our means, saving and investing carefully. As Jacob grew, so did the business. By his 10th birthday, Morrison Construction had 30 employees and had expanded into commercial buildings. We were doing well financially, but you wouldn't know it from our lifestyle. We drove reliable cars rather than luxury models, took one nice family vacation each year, and put the rest away for retirement and Jacob's education. We raised Jacob with love but not extravagance. We wanted him to understand the value of money and the importance of hard work. When he wanted expensive sneakers as a teenager, I offered to pay half if he earned the rest. When he needed a car for college, we helped him buy a used one, not the new sports car he coveted. Jacob was a bright kid, did well in school, and made us proud when he got accepted to a prestigious university. That's when I noticed the first shifts in his personality. Suddenly, our home wasn't good enough. Our cars were embarrassing. His new college friends came from money, and he became increasingly conscious of how we appeared to them. "Dad, can't you at least buy a new car? The business is doing well enough, right?" he'd ask during holiday breaks. I tried to explain our values to him, how we preferred financial security over showing off, but he'd roll his eyes like I was speaking a foreign language. After undergraduate studies, Jacob decided to attend law school. That's where he met Tiffany Caldwell. She came from old money, her father a banking executive, her mother from a family with real estate holdings across 3 states. The first time Jacob brought her home, I watched her eyes scan our living room, taking in the comfortable but unfashionable furniture, the family photos in simple frames, the bookshelves filled with paperbacks rather than leather-bound collections. "Your home is so quaint," she said, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It must be nice to live so simply." Eleanor squeezed my hand under the dinner table, a signal we'd developed over years of marriage. This one meant, be patient, be kind, but take note. Their relationship progressed quickly. Within a year of meeting, Jacob announced they were engaged. Tiffany immediately began planning what could only be described as a royal wedding. When the initial estimates came in at over $100,000, I suggested something more moderate. "We want to help, son, but that's a down payment on a house," I said. Tiffany's face hardened into a polite mask. "My parents expect a certain standard, Mr. Morrison. Jacob shouldn't have to start his marriage with less just because." She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Just because you can't afford it. To keep the peace, Eleanor and I agreed to contribute $60,000 to the wedding, more than we'd ever spent on any single event in our lives. What Jacob didn't know was that this came from money we'd been quietly saving for his future inheritance, not from our daily operating budget. We had, over decades of careful investing, amassed significant wealth that we kept private. Our net worth at that time was approaching $4 million, but we lived as though it was a tenth of that. The wedding was extravagant by any standard. Tiffany wore a designer gown that cost more than our first car. The venue was a historic mansion with manicured gardens, the food prepared by a celebrity chef, the alcohol top shelf, and flowing freely. Throughout the event, I noticed Tiffany's parents introducing Jacob as studying to be a corporate attorney, rather than acknowledging our family or background. After the honeymoon, they returned with news. They'd found the perfect starter home. It was a newly built 5-bedroom house in an exclusive neighborhood, with a price tag north of $1 million. Jacob had just started his final year of law school and had no income. Tiffany worked at a boutique marketing firm, making good money but nowhere near enough to qualify for such a mortgage. "We thought maybe you could help with the down payment, Dad," Jacob said, showing me pictures on his phone. "It's a great investment opportunity." Eleanor had just been diagnosed with early-stage breast cancer that week. We hadn't told Jacob yet, not wanting to cast a shadow over his return. Sitting there in our living room, looking at pictures of a house that cost more than I'd allowed myself to spend despite having the means, I felt a complex mix of emotions. Part of me wanted to tell him about our actual financial situation, to explain that while we could indeed help, we chose to live differently. Another part wanted to share the news about Eleanor's health, to remind him that money wasn't everything. Instead, I said, "Let me discuss it with your mother. This is a big request, son." That night, Eleanor and I talked for hours. Despite her diagnosis and the treatments ahead, she was more concerned about Jacob. "He's changing, Andy," she said, using the nickname only she ever called me. "I'm worried about the influence Tiffany has on him." "Maybe it's just a phase," I suggested. "The excitement of starting a new life." Eleanor looked at me with those wise eyes that always saw the truth. "We should help them with the house, but keep our financial situation quiet. Let's see how things develop." So we did. We provided $200,000 for their down payment, structuring it in a way that kept a portion of ownership in my name. Though Jacob didn't understand the legal details, he was just grateful for the check. "Thanks, Dad. I knew you'd come through," he said, as if my agreement had been a foregone conclusion. A week later, we told them about Eleanor's cancer. Tiffany's first question was whether we had good health insurance. Eleanor's cancer treatment began immediately. The doctors were cautiously optimistic since they'd caught it early, but the chemotherapy was brutal. She lost her beautiful silver hair within weeks and dropped 20 pounds from her already slender frame. I took a step back from active management of my company to be with her, accompanying her to every appointment, holding her hand through the worst of the nausea and fatigue. During those first few months, Jacob visited regularly, though rarely with Tiffany. She was busy settling into the new house or swamped at work. When she did come, she would sit as far from Eleanor as the room allowed, as if illness might be contagious through proximity. "She's probably just uncomfortable around sick people," Eleanor would say. always finding excuses for others' behavior. Not everyone knows how to act in these situations, but I noticed how Jacob was changing too. His visits became shorter, more perfunctory. He'd glance at his watch frequently, ask brief questions about treatment without really listening to the answers. The warm, empathetic boy we'd raised seemed to be fading, replaced by someone more concerned with appearances and obligations. Thanksgiving that year marked a turning point. Eleanor was between treatment cycles and feeling stronger, so she insisted on hosting dinner as she always had. I tried to convince her to let me handle it or to have it catered, but she was determined. "I need normal, Andy," she said. "I need to feel like myself again." So I helped her prepare a traditional meal, doing the heavy lifting while she supervised and handled the delicate work of seasoning and presentation. Jacob and Tiffany arrived an hour late, with Tiffany's parents in tow, an unexpected addition they hadn't bothered to mention ahead of time. "Sorry we're late," Jacob said, not sounding sorry at all. Traffic was terrible from the city. Tiffany's mother, Sylvia, looked around our home with the same evaluating gaze her daughter had used at their first visit. "How long have you lived in this neighborhood, Eleanor?" she asked, making it sound like we resided in an abandoned warehouse district rather than a pleasant suburban community. 30 years this spring," Eleanor answered proudly. "We raised Jacob in this house and never felt the need to upgrade," Sylvia pressed, running a finger along our dining room table as if checking for dust. Throughout the meal, Tiffany and her parents made similar comments, each one a small cut. The china was retro. It was Eleanor's grandmother's set, used for special occasions. The silverware was quaint, a wedding gift we'd cherished for decades. The neighborhood was changing, code for no longer exclusive enough. But the worst moment came when Tiffany, 3 glasses of wine into the evening, started talking about their home renovations. "We're redoing the entire kitchen," she announced. "The builder's fixtures were so basic. We're putting in Italian marble and custom cabinetry." "That sounds expensive," I commented. "Well, not everyone wants to live in a time capsule from the 1980s, she replied, with a laugh that didn't disguise the barb. "No offense, but this kitchen could use a complete overhaul. Those countertops are practically antiques." Eleanor, still thin and pale from her treatments, flinched as if physically struck. The kitchen had been renovated 10 years earlier, not exactly new but far from outdated, and she'd chosen every element with care. Jacob, instead of defending his mother or changing the subject, chuckled along with his wife. "Yeah, Dad, you could afford to update a few things around here. The business must be doing okay." What neither of them knew was that the business was doing more than okay. It had grown to become one of the largest commercial contractors in the state. I had diversified our investments over the years, with Eleanor's sharp mind helping guide our financial decisions. Between the business, our investment portfolio, and real estate holdings, our net worth had recently surpassed $5 million. But we had our reasons for living modestly and keeping our wealth private. After that Thanksgiving, the dynamic shifted further. Tiffany began making suggestions about our will and estate planning, always framed as helpful advice rather than self-interest. "You really should consider setting up trusts for your future grandchildren," she said during one visit, shortly after Eleanor had returned from a particularly difficult hospital stay. "Jacob and I are planning to start a family soon, and educational costs will only increase. We've taken care of our estate planning," Eleanor replied quietly. "Everything is in order, but have you updated it recently?" Tiffany pressed. "Tax laws change, and there are so many ways to minimize estate taxes these days." What she didn't know was that Eleanor and I had indeed updated our will just after her diagnosis, working with our longtime attorney, Frank Dempsey, who was also one of my closest friends. We had made careful decisions about our estate, based not on tax advantages but on our values and what we were observing in our son's marriage. As Eleanor's condition worsened, Jacob and Tiffany's visits became even less frequent. They had excuses ready: work commitments, social obligations, home repairs. When they did visit, conversations inevitably turned to financial matters, subtle digs about our lifestyle choices, or thinly veiled inquiries about inheritance. By the time Eleanor entered hospice care at home, 6 months after her diagnosis, they were visiting just once every 2 weeks, staying less than an hour each time. Tiffany would sit in our living room scrolling through her phone while Jacob made awkward small talk, neither of them offering to help with Eleanor's care or the household tasks that had become overwhelming for me. During Eleanor's final week, when it became clear the end was near, I called Jacob daily with updates. He finally took time off work, but even then, he spent more time in our guest room on conference calls than at his mother's bedside. The night before Eleanor passed, she had a moment of clarity after days of medication-induced confusion. She gripped my hand with surprising strength and looked directly into my eyes. "Andy, listen to me," she whispered. "Be careful with Jacob and Tiffany. Don't let them know everything at once. Test them first." "What do you mean, sweetheart?" I asked, thinking it might be the medication talking. "The money," she said. "They don't see you, Andy. They see dollar signs. Promise me you'll be careful." "I promise," I said, tears running down my face. She died peacefully the next morning, with me holding one hand and Jacob reluctantly holding the other. Tiffany was downstairs, making calls about the funeral arrangements, already taking control of a situation that wasn't hers to manage. The funeral was exactly what Eleanor wouldn't have wanted: ostentatious, formal, filled with people she barely knew. Tiffany had insisted on handling the details, overriding my preferences at every turn. She chose an expensive casket, elaborate floral arrangements, and even the outfit Eleanor would wear, discarding the simple blue dress Eleanor had set aside years ago for this purpose. "This is what people expect," Tiffany said when I objected. "We need to maintain appearances." Throughout the service, I noticed her attention was not on mourning or supporting Jacob or me, but on managing perceptions, making sure everything looked appropriate for the society friends she'd invited. She spent more time arranging photo opportunities beside the flower displays than comforting her husband, who stood awkwardly at the edge of the gathering, looking lost. A week after the funeral came the reading of the will. Frank conducted it at our home, his kind face serious as he explained the document's contents to Jacob, Tiffany, and me. "The will is quite straightforward," he began. "Eleanor has left her personal items and family heirlooms to both Andrew and Jacob, with specific items listed in this addendum." He handed Jacob a list, which Tiffany immediately took from his hands. "As for financial assets," Frank continued, "Eleanor has left $200,000 directly to Jacob, with the remainder of the estate passing to Andrew." Tiffany's head snapped up. "That's it? 200,000? There must be more." Frank looked at her steadily. "The remainder of Eleanor's share of their marital assets passes to Andrew, as is standard in most marriages. Of course, Andrew will have his own estate planning to consider going forward. But what about the business?" Tiffany demanded. "Jacob is the only child. Surely he inherits that." "The business is primarily in Andrew's name," Frank explained patiently. "Eleanor's minority share has now passed to him as well." I watched Tiffany's face transform as she processed this information. The carefully cultivated sympathy she'd been displaying vanished, replaced by barely concealed anger and disappointment. Her eyes calculated, recalibrated. I could practically see the gears turning as she reassessed her approach. "Of course, we're not concerned about money at a time like this," she finally said, her voice honeyed again but her eyes cold. "We just want to make sure everything is properly taken care of for everyone's future." But from that day forward, everything changed. The mask had slipped, and I had seen what Eleanor had warned me about in her final lucidity. The gradual betrayal that had been building for years was now accelerating, and I was about to experience it firsthand, without Eleanor's buffer of kindness and excuses to soften the blows. The first month after Eleanor's death passed in a fog of grief. I moved through our home like a ghost, touching her things, sitting in her favorite chair, sleeping on only my side of the bed as if she might still come to claim her space. The silence was deafening after 45 years of shared conversation, laughter, and even comfortable quiet together. I didn't hear from Jacob for 2 weeks after the will reading. When he finally called, His voice was carefully neutral. "Dad, Tiffany and I were thinking we should come check on you this weekend. Make sure you're doing okay on your own." Their visit began with a performance of concern. Tiffany brought a casserole she claimed to have made herself, though the container from an upscale deli was barely disguised. Jacob asked perfunctory questions about my health and daily activities. Then, less than an hour into their visit, the real agenda emerged. "Dad, we've been thinking," Jacob began, exchanging a look with Tiffany. "This house is really too big for just you now. All these stairs can't be good for someone your age." "I'm managing fine," I replied. "I've lived here for 30 years. I know every creaking floorboard, but it's so much maintenance," Tiffany chimed in. "And the property taxes must be a burden on your retirement income." "My finances are in order," I said simply. "Still," Jacob pressed, "there are some really nice retirement communities we could look at. Places where you'd have company, activities, people to check on you, and medical staff," Tiffany added, as though I were an invalid at 72, despite being in excellent health. "I appreciate the concern, but I'm staying here," I said firmly. They exchanged another look, and the subject temporarily dropped, but it was just the beginning. Their visits increased in frequency, but decreased in warmth. Each time, they arrived with some new suggestion about my living situation, my finances, or how I should simplify by selling or giving away possessions, particularly those with any significant value. One afternoon, I returned from a doctor's appointment to find Tiffany in our bedroom, examining Eleanor's jewelry box. "What are you doing?" I asked from the doorway, startling her. "Oh," Jacob said I could look through some of Eleanor's things. She replied smoothly. "We were thinking about what might be appropriate to preserve for our future children." "Jacob doesn't have the authority to give away his mother's things," I said, "and we agreed you'd both come with me to go through her belongings together." "Don't be so sensitive, Andrew," she said, using my first name in that condescending tone she'd developed. "We're family. These things should stay in the family anyway." The next week, I noticed several items missing: a silver picture frame from Eleanor's desk, a small crystal vase that had been her mother's, a first edition book from our shelves. When I called Jacob to ask about them, he claimed they had borrowed them for safekeeping. "The house isn't very secure, Dad. We worried those valuable things might be stolen if you forgot to lock up." They never returned a single item. Their tactics grew bolder as weeks turned to months. I overheard Tiffany on her phone in our kitchen, not realizing I had come in through the back door. "It's maddening," she was saying to someone. "The old man is just sitting in that house, probably burning through money that should be going to Jacob. We're just waiting for him to kick the bucket at this point. But who knows how long that will take." I quietly retreated, my heart heavy with a pain different from grief, sharper somehow. 6 months after Eleanor's death, they began bringing real estate agents to the house without my permission. "We just want you to hear the options," Jacob said when I confronted him. "This place could sell for a good price in today's market." "The market doesn't matter because I'm not selling," I replied. Tiffany's smile tightened. "Being stubborn doesn't help anyone, Andrew. That money could be better used to secure your care and build something for the next generation." By next generation, I knew she meant their future children, not any broader concept of legacy. And by your care, she meant the cheapest facility they could find that wouldn't reflect poorly on them to their friends. I began finding brochures for retirement communities around the house after their visits. Not the upscale ones where active seniors lived independently in comfortable condos with amenities, but the more institutional type, where care was basic and rooms were small. "Just looking at options," Jacob would say when I'd confront him. No pressure, but there was pressure, constant and increasing. They commented on every expense I incurred, no matter how minor. When I mentioned hiring a weekly cleaning service since maintaining the house was becoming more difficult alone, Tiffany immediately objected. "That's so wasteful. You could just downsize instead." When I bought a new television because the old one had died, Jacob questioned whether I should be spending like that on fixed income. What they didn't know was that my income was far from fixed. The business was still generating significant revenue, even with my reduced role. and our investments had been carefully structured to provide consistent returns. I was drawing less than 30% of my potential income, preserving capital for the future. A future I was increasingly uncertain would include my son in the way Eleanor and I had planned. The most revealing moment came on a Sunday afternoon about 9 months after Eleanor's death. Jacob and Tiffany had stopped by unannounced, a tactic they'd begun using to catch me off guard. I had been in the backyard, tending to Eleanor's garden, which I maintained as a way of feeling connected to her. I came inside to find them in my home office. The desk drawers open, papers spread across the surface. "What the hell are you doing?" I demanded, my patience finally breaking. They jumped, guilty but not particularly apologetic. "Dad, we're concerned about how you're managing," Jacob said, not quite meeting my eyes. "We wanted to make sure your bills are being paid on time, that you're not being taken advantage of." "By looking through my private papers without permission?" I asked incredulously. "Family doesn't need permission," Tiffany stated, as if this were an established fact. "We're just looking out for you." Later that evening, after they'd left, I found my file cabinet had been thoroughly ransacked, with particular attention paid to bank statements and investment documents. Fortunately, most of my financial information was with Frank or stored securely elsewhere, a precaution Eleanor had suggested years earlier when she first noticed Tiffany's interest in our finances. The following week, I overheard the most damning conversation of all. They had come for another surprise visit, and I had gone to the basement to fetch a bottle of wine. The kitchen vent connected to the basement ceiling, and their voices carried clearly, neither of them aware I could hear every word. "We need to accelerate the timeline," Jacob was saying. "The longer he stays in this house, the more the inheritance gets eaten away." "I know," Tiffany replied. "My father says property values in this neighborhood are peaking. If we wait too long to sell, we could lose 100,000 or more. Plus, who knows what he's spending from the business profits each month," Jacob added. "I should have been brought into the company years ago. Then we'd know exactly what's going on." "Well, your mother didn't do you any favors with that will," Tiffany said bitterly. "But there are other ways to handle this. My cousin's father-in-law was resistant too, until they got a doctor to suggest he wasn't competent to manage his own affairs anymore." There was a pause before Jacob responded, his voice uncertain. "I don't know if we need to go that far. Just keep it in mind as an option," Tiffany said. "Sometimes the elderly need decisions made for them, for their own good." I stood frozen at the bottom of the basement stairs, the wine bottle cold in my hand, a different kind of chill spreading through my chest. My son and his wife were actively plotting to have me declared incompetent, to seize control of my assets, to place me somewhere against my will, all while discussing my home and money as if they were already theirs. The final confirmation of their true character came on my 73rd birthday. They arranged a small dinner, not at their home or mine, but at a mediocre restaurant where they had a coupon. Jacob presented me with a gift, wrapped in paper so cheap it tore as I opened it. Inside was a glossy brochure for Sunny Pines Retirement Community, with a post-it note stuck to the front. "We've put down a deposit to hold a room. Move-in available next month." I looked up to find them both watching me expectantly, as if I should be grateful. "This is your birthday gift to me?" I asked quietly. "A room in a nursing home?" "It's not a nursing home, Dad," Jacob corrected quickly. "It's an assisted living community. There's a big difference. And it's very affordable," Tiffany added, as if this were a selling point. "Your monthly expenses would drop significantly." I flipped through the brochure silently. Sunny Pines was exactly the type of place Eleanor and I had promised each other we'd never end up. Understaffed, with tiny shared rooms, institutional food, and minimal activities beyond weekly bingo. It was a warehouse for the elderly, not a community. "This is thoughtful," I said finally, folding the brochure and placing it back in the envelope. "I'll certainly give it consideration." They smiled, pleased with themselves, completely missing the coldness in my voice. As we ate the bland food and they talked about themselves, I made a decision. Eleanor had been right. It was time to test them, to confirm what I already knew in my heart, and then to act accordingly. The next morning, I called Frank and set a plan in motion. 2 weeks after my birthday, I woke with genuine chest pain and shortness of breath. Years of regular checkups told me it wasn't a heart attack, likely just stress and grief catching up with me physically. But it was concerning enough that I called Jacob. Tiffany answered his phone. "Jacob's phone," she said crisply. "Tiffany, it's Andrew. I need to speak with Jacob. I'm not feeling well and might need some help." There was a pause. "He's in a meeting right now. Can it wait?" "I'm having chest pains," I explained. "Nothing severe, but I'd feel better if someone could drive me to the doctor." "Oh," she said, sounding inconvenienced rather than concerned. "Well, we're both really swamped today. Can you call a neighbor? Or maybe a taxi?" "Never mind," I said. "I'll figure something out." I ended up driving myself to the emergency room, where they admitted me for observation. The diagnosis was indeed stress-related, not a heart attack, but they wanted to monitor me for a few days given my age and circumstances. I was alone in the hospital for 3 days before Jacob and Tiffany finally visited. I had left messages each day, but they claimed they'd been super busy and assumed I was fine since the hospital hadn't called them directly. "So what's the damage?" Tiffany asked after perfunctory inquiries about my health, her eyes flicking to the monitors and equipment around the room. "Does your insurance cover all this?" "My insurance is adequate," I replied. "Well, these things can add up," she pressed. "The deductibles alone can be outrageous." Jacob at least had the decency to look embarrassed. "What she means is, we want to make sure you're not worried about the expenses on top of everything else." Before I could respond, my doctor came in for rounds. After checking my vitals and reviewing my chart, he addressed us all. "Mr. Morrison is doing much better, but I'm concerned about him returning to an empty house. Is there someone who could stay with him for a few days? Or perhaps he could stay with family?" Tiffany's face immediately tensed. "We both work full-time, and our guest room is being renovated right now. Actually," Jacob added quickly, "we're leaving for a weekend trip tomorrow. It's been planned for months, non-refundable tickets." "I see," the doctor said, looking between them. "Well, there are home health services that could check in daily. Let's discuss options before discharge." After the doctor left, Tiffany's irritation was palpable. "This is exactly why the retirement community makes sense," she said. "You need supervision, Andrew. We can't put our lives on hold every time you have a health scare." They left shortly after, promising to call the next day. They didn't. The hospital arranged for a home health nurse to check on me every other day for a week, a service mostly covered by my insurance. I returned to an empty house, more certain than ever that Eleanor's warning had been prescient. The day after I got home, I discovered why they had been so busy. Jacob had used his spare key to access my house while I was hospitalized. My home office had been thoroughly searched again, with financial documents strewn across the desk and floor. My computer showed signs of being accessed, though my most important passwords and accounts weren't stored there. When I called Jacob to confront him, he deflected. "We were just looking for your insurance information, Dad. The hospital needed it." "The hospital had my insurance card," I countered. "I gave it to them on admission." "Well, they asked us for additional information," he lied smoothly. "Anyway, how are you feeling today?" The conversation shifted, but my resolve hardened. The next morning, I called Frank and asked him to come over. He arrived within the hour, his weathered face creased with concern as I explained everything that had happened. "I'm not surprised, Andy," he said, using the nickname only he and Eleanor used. "I've seen this pattern before. The vultures start circling when they smell money, even when it's family. Sometimes especially when it's family." "Eleanor warned me," I said. "She told me to test them before making any final decisions about the inheritance." Frank nodded thoughtfully. "A test is a good idea, something that will reveal their true characters beyond any doubt." "What do you suggest?" I asked. "Let them think you're in financial trouble," he said. "Serious enough that you need help, but not so dire that they think there's nothing left to inherit. See how they react when you're a burden rather than an asset." "And if they fail the test?" I asked, already knowing the answer. Then we implement Plan B, Frank said grimly. We've prepared for this possibility in your estate planning. Over the next week, Frank and I met with my financial advisors, carefully securing my assets. We transferred ownership structures, updated beneficiaries, and made sure everything was protected from potential legal challenges. I gave Frank power of attorney, with specific limitations and oversight to prevent misuse. Most importantly, I established the Eleanor Morrison Memorial Foundation for Cancer Research and Family Support. With an initial anonymous donation of $1 million, the foundation would be revealed and fully funded later, depending on the results of my test. Frank also helped me identify and purchase a new home, a comfortable 2-bedroom condominium in a vibrant community 300 miles away, near the coast where Eleanor and I had always talked about retiring. The purchase was made through a trust to keep it private. What about their house? I asked Frank during one of our planning sessions. The one I helped them buy? Frank checked his records. The ownership structure we created gives you a 40% interest in the property. It was drafted so that you could gift that interest to Jacob eventually, but it also means you have rights to force a sale if necessary. Let's keep that as an option, I said. I want to see how far they're willing to go first. With the logistics taken care of, it was time to set the stage. I deliberately let the house become slightly unkempt, not hiring my usual cleaning service for several weeks. I left past due notice copies visible on my desk, manufactured but convincing, suggesting cash flow problems. I changed the password on my computer to something simple that Jacob would likely guess if he snooped again. Most importantly, I arranged for Jacob to accidentally see a bank statement showing my primary checking account with less than $5,000, alongside a letter from my company's accountant, actually drafted by Frank, hinting at significant business losses due to a project gone wrong. The bait was set. Now it was time to see if they would take it, and just how far their greed and callousness would go. Jacob called the very next day after spotting the engineered bank statement. "Hey Dad, just checking in. Haven't heard from you in a few days," he said, his tone carefully casual. "I'm fine," I replied, matching his affected nonchalance. "Just dealing with some business issues." "Oh, anything serious?" He couldn't quite hide the eager concern in his voice. "Nothing I can't handle," I said. "Just a project that went over budget. You know how construction can be." "Right, sure," he said. "Listen, why don't you come over for dinner this Sunday? Tiffany's making her special roast. We haven't had you over in ages." The sudden invitation was telling. They'd never invited me to their home for a casual dinner before, always meeting at restaurants where the visit could be timed and controlled. "That would be nice," I said. "What time should I come?" 6 o'clock. "And don't worry about bringing anything." When Sunday arrived, I dressed carefully in clothes that were clean but slightly rumpled, as if I hadn't bothered with the dry cleaner recently. I didn't shave, allowing my normally neat appearance to suggest subtle neglect. Their house, the one I'd helped them buy, was impressive by any standard. 5,000 square feet of luxury in a gated community, with manicured landscaping and a 3-car garage housing their matching luxury SUVs. I remembered when Jacob had described it as a modest starter home with a straight face. Tiffany answered the door with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Andrew, come in. You look comfortable." The emphasis on the last word made it clear she found my appearance lacking, exactly as I'd intended. Jacob emerged from the kitchen, holding an expensive bottle of wine but conspicuously not opening it. "Dad, good to see you. We have a cheaper red open already if you'd like a glass." "That would be fine," I said, noting how the expensive bottle disappeared back into a cabinet rather than being shared. Their home was even more lavish inside than out. They'd clearly spent a small fortune on renovations since my last visit. The kitchen now featured the Italian marble countertops Tiffany had mentioned at Thanksgiving, along with commercial-grade appliances and custom cabinetry. The furnishings throughout were designer pieces, the art on the walls original and costly. "You've done a lot with the place," I commented as we sat in their formal living room. "Business must be good, Jacob." "Can't complain," he said with a touch of smugness. "The firm is considering me for junior partner next year." "That's wonderful." I said. I'm proud of you. Tiffany steered the conversation almost immediately to my situation. Andrew, Jacob mentioned you might be having some business difficulties. Nothing too serious, I hope. Just a challenging project, I said vaguely. Construction has ups and downs. Of course, she said, her eyes calculating. But at your age, wouldn't it be easier to let the younger executives take over the stressful parts? You've earned a real retirement. Throughout dinner, they continued probing, their questions becoming less subtle as the evening progressed, and they consumed most of the cheap wine themselves. The house was looking a bit untidy when I stopped by last week, Jacob mentioned casually. Is the cleaning service still coming? I've cut back on some expenses, I said, watching their reactions closely. Just temporarily. Tiffany and Jacob exchanged a look that spoke volumes. Concern, but not for my welfare, rather for what it might mean for their future expectations. You know, Tiffany said, setting down her fork, there are financial advisors who specialize in helping people your age protect their assets. My father knows several excellent ones. I appreciate the suggestion, I said. Frank has been handling my affairs for decades, but I'll keep it in mind. Frank is a friend more than a professional advisor, Jacob said dismissively. Sometimes you need objective expertise. The conversation continued in this vein, with them offering increasingly pointed assistance that all led in the same direction, them having greater visibility and control over my finances. As dessert was served, Tiffany struck directly at the heart of the matter. Andrew, if you're having cash flow problems, have you considered selling the house? The market is excellent right now, and you could invest the proceeds more efficiently. It's an option, I admitted, setting up the next phase of my test. But the house needs some repairs before it would show well, and I'm not sure I have the funds right now. What kind of repairs? Jacob asked, leaning forward. Nothing major. Some painting, fixing that loose banister, updating the master bathroom. Maybe $15,000 worth of work. That's quite an investment just to sell, Tiffany said, frowning. The return would be worth it, I replied. But in the meantime, I might need to tighten my belt a bit more. I watched them process this information, the wheels turning behind their eyes. They saw opportunity in my apparent financial distress, a chance to finally push me out of the house and get their hands on whatever value remained. As the evening wound down, I decided it was time to make my final move. I waited until Tiffany had cleared the dessert plates, and Jacob had poured himself another glass of wine. I hate to bring this up, I began, injecting a note of shame into my voice, but I've had an unexpected expense this month. My medication costs have gone up since they changed my insurance plan. That's unfortunate, Jacob said non-committally. Yes, well, I was wondering if I could borrow a small amount to tide me over until next month's business distributions. Just $80 for a prescription I need to refill tomorrow. The change in the atmosphere was immediate and palpable. Tiffany, returning from the kitchen, froze in the doorway. Jacob's expression shifted from casual interest to guarded suspicion. $80? He repeated, as if I'd asked for $80,000. Just until next week, I assured him. The business account gets its monthly deposit on Friday. Tiffany walked stiffly back to the table, setting her hands on the back of her chair, her knuckles white with tension. Andrew, she said, her voice tight, we're not a bank. If you're having money problems, you need to address the bigger picture, not ask for handouts. It's not a handout, I said mildly. It's a small loan from family for necessary medication. Do you have any idea how this sounds? Tiffany's voice rose, her carefully maintained composure cracking. You own a business. You have a valuable home, and you're asking to borrow $80 like some beggar? Tiffany, Jacob cautioned, glancing between us. No, Jacob. He needs to hear this, she snapped. We've been trying to help him for months, suggesting ways to secure his future, offering solutions, and he's refused everything. And now he has the nerve to ask us for money? It's just a temporary situation, I said, maintaining my calm in the face of her growing anger. That's when she exploded. She strode around the table until she stood directly over me, her face contorted with rage and disgust. Temporary. Nothing about this is temporary. You're old, Andrew. You're becoming a financial drain, and it's only going to get worse. We have our future to think about, our children's education to save for. We can't be your personal ATM. Tiffany, that's enough, Jacob said weakly, but made no move to intervene. It's not enough, she shouted. He needs to hear the truth. We've wasted enough time coddling him. She turned back to me, her eyes cold with contempt. If you need money so badly, sell your house like we've been telling you to. Move somewhere affordable. Get a part-time job if you have to. A job? I echoed, genuinely surprised by the suggestion given my age and business ownership. At 73? Why not? Plenty of seniors work as greeters or baggers. You're not special, Andrew. You're not entitled to live beyond your means and then expect us to cover the difference. I stood slowly, maintaining my dignity despite her tirade. I think I should go. Thank you for dinner. Yes, you should go, she agreed venomously. And don't come back asking for handouts. As I turned to leave, I said quietly, I'm sorry to have upset you. I thought family helped family in times of need. That's when it happened. Tiffany's face contorted with a rage that seemed disproportionate to the situation, revealing the true depths of her contempt. Family? You want to talk about family? She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a hiss. Real family would have set their son up properly, not hoarded money for decades while living like misers. Real family would have brought Jacob into the business instead of keeping him at arm's length. Real family wouldn't pretend to be poor and then come begging for scraps. I stood my ground, looking her directly in the eyes. I only asked to borrow $80 for medication, Tiffany. A medication I need. Go work, you old parasite, she screamed. And before I could react, her hand flashed out, connecting with my cheek with surprising force. The slap caught me off balance, and at 73, my reflexes weren't what they once were. I stumbled backward, tripping over the dining room rug, and fell hard onto the floor. For a moment, the room was completely silent. Jacob stood frozen, his face a mask of shock. Tiffany loomed over me, her chest heaving. No remorse in her eyes, only a fleeting glimpse of concern that she might have gone too far in front of a witness. Dad? Jacob finally said, taking a half step forward. Are you okay? But he didn't reach down to help me up. He didn't condemn his wife's actions. He didn't offer the $80. He just stood there, paralyzed between basic human decency and the life he'd chosen with Tiffany. I got to my feet slowly, my dignity intact despite the stinging cheek and bruised hip. I think I have my answer, I said quietly. Good night, Jacob. Tiffany. Dad. Wait, Jacob called as I walked to the door. She didn't mean to. It's just been stressful lately. But even in his weak attempt at damage control, there was no apology, no real recognition of how utterly they had failed this test of basic humanity. I left without another word, closing the door gently behind me. In my car, I touched my cheek where the slap had landed, feeling a strange sense of clarity and resolution. The test was complete, and the results were unambiguous. Eleanor had been right, and now I knew exactly what needed to be done. I drove home that night with a strange sense of calm. The sting of Tiffany's slap had faded, but the clarity it provided remained sharp and certain. In that moment of physical assault, when Jacob had failed to defend or even help me, the last lingering doubts about my course of action had vanished. Early the next morning, I called Frank. It's time, I said simply when he answered. That bad? He asked, hearing something in my voice. Worse than we anticipated, I replied, and described the previous night's events. Frank was silent for a moment after I finished. She actually struck you, and Jacob did nothing? Nothing meaningful, I confirmed. Then we proceed immediately, he said, his voice hardening with resolve. I'll have the papers ready by noon. The legal machinery that Frank had prepared in advance moved swiftly once activated. As a 40% owner of Jacob and Tiffany's house, I had significant rights that they had either forgotten about or never fully understood. The property had been structured as a tenancy in common rather than joint tenancy, giving me clear authority to force a partition sale. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, Frank had filed the necessary legal notices to initiate the sale of their home. Given the ownership structure and the specific terms we had established when I provided the down payment, they would have limited recourse to block or delay the process. "How long will this take?" I asked Frank as we reviewed the documents. "The court could take weeks to process everything, but I've marked it as urgent due to your age and circumstances," he explained. "More importantly, I've included notice of intent to sell to several pre-approved buyers, one of whom has already expressed serious interest. They'll fight it," I predicted. Frank nodded. "They'll try. But the paperwork is ironclad, and Tiffany's assault gives us additional leverage. We have options if they become difficult, including reporting the assault to the police." The thought of pressing charges against my daughter-in-law wasn't appealing, but I kept it as a potential last resort if necessary. With the legal process initiated, we moved to secure my other assets. Frank and I spent the afternoon transferring remaining funds to the accounts we'd established earlier, ensuring that everything was protected from potential challenges. We formally funded the Eleanor Morrison Memorial Foundation with an initial public donation of $2 million, with provisions for the remainder of my estate to follow upon my death. The foundation paperwork includes specific language preventing Jacob or Tiffany from ever serving on the board or receiving compensation from it, Frank noted as we finalized the documents. Eleanor would be pleased with how it's structured. By late afternoon, we had contacted Jacob's childhood friends, those he had grown up with but gradually abandoned as Tiffany isolated him in their new social circle. I had maintained contact with many of them and their parents over the years, watching them grow into decent men and women with families of their own. I wrote each one a brief, factual letter, explaining the situation without embellishment or bitterness. I didn't ask them to take sides, merely to be aware of what had transpired and to understand why I was making the choices I was. Several responded immediately with messages of support and dismay. "I never liked her," wrote Michael, Jacob's best friend from elementary through high school. "I tried to warn him years ago, but he was too dazzled by the lifestyle she promised. I'm sorry it came to this, Mr. Morrison. You deserved better." As evening approached, I began packing the personal items I wanted to take to my new home. Not the valuable things, but the meaningful ones. Photos of Eleanor and our early years together, the books she had loved, the small pottery bowl Jacob had made in 3rd grade before money and status became his measuring sticks for worth. I hired a professional photographer to document the property in its current state, establishing a clear record of its condition before I left. This would prevent any later claims that I had damaged the property or removed items I shouldn't have. The photographer, a young woman named Diane, listened to a simplified version of my situation and offered unexpected support. "My grandfather went through something similar with my uncle," she told me. "Sometimes the only way people learn is through consequences. I'll make sure every detail is documented perfectly." She took hundreds of photos, including specific shots of the utility meters, the dated newspaper I placed in each room, and the detailed inventory of items I was taking versus leaving. She also took a poignant series of me standing outside the home, the SOLLD sign from the real estate company already installed in the yard, and the certificate of donation to the Eleanor Morrison Memorial Foundation held carefully in my hands. "These will tell the story better than words," she said, showing me the preview on her camera. "Sometimes a single image captures what pages of explanation can't." I had initially planned to leave a lengthy letter detailing my feelings and the reasoning behind my decisions, but as the day progressed, I realized that brevity would be more powerful. Jacob and Tiffany had shown me who they truly were. Lengthy explanations wouldn't change that reality. Instead, I wrote a simple note on Eleanor's stationery, her monogram at the top, a reminder of what they had both dismissed. "You chose money over family. I chose dignity over both. The house has been sold. The proceeds went to Eleanor's Cancer Foundation. Your true inheritance was love, but you valued dollars instead. Goodbye." I left the note on the kitchen counter, alongside copies of the legal documents showing the house sale and the foundation donation. No dramatic gestures, no elaborate revenge schemes, just the cold, factual consequences of their own actions. By the time I locked the door for the final time, a strange peace had settled over me. This house held 40 years of memories, but the most precious ones lived in my heart, not within these walls. Eleanor was with me in memory, not in the structure we had shared. As I drove away, heading toward my new home and the next chapter of my life, I found myself recalling something Eleanor had said during her final weeks. The truest test of what we've built isn't in what we leave behind, Andy. It's in how we've loved, who we've helped, and whether we've lived with integrity. Everything else is just details. I had tried to honor those values throughout my life, and now, in this final lesson to my son, I hoped I was continuing to do so, even through the necessary pain of consequence. The coastal community I moved to was everything Eleanor and I had dreamed of for our retirement. My condominium overlooked the water, with a balcony where I could sit each morning watching the sunrise, imagining Eleanor beside me as I sipped my coffee. It was smaller than our family home, but perfect for one person beginning a new chapter, with enough space for visiting friends, but not so much that it felt empty. The first calls from Jacob began within hours of them discovering the note and empty house. I let them go to voicemail, not yet ready for that conversation. His messages evolved from confused, "Dad, what's going on?" "Call me back immediately," to angry, "You can't just sell our house. We have rights," to desperate, "Please, Dad, we need to talk about this." "Tiffany's hysterical. We have nowhere to go." Frank kept me updated on the legal proceedings. As expected, they had attempted to challenge the sale, but the ownership structure and documentation were unassailable. The house had sold quickly to one of the pre-approved buyers, a young family who offered fair market value, unaware of the circumstances behind the sale. The funds have been transferred directly to the foundation as instructed, Frank informed me after the closing. Jacob and Tiffany received notice that they have 30 days to vacate the premises. I had arranged for the foundation to be publicly announced with a press release and small ceremony at the hospital where Eleanor had received treatment. I didn't attend in person, not wanting to make it about me, but Diane's photographs were delivered to Jacob and Tiffany the day of the announcement. Images of the sold sign, the foundation certificate, and me standing outside what had been their home, looking not triumphant but resolute. According to mutual friends, the photographs had the intended effect. Jacob and Tiffany had been in the middle of explaining to their social circle that there had been a misunderstanding about the house ownership when the envelope arrived. Tiffany had opened it in front of everyone, expecting legal papers they could dismiss or challenge, only to find the undeniable visual evidence of what had transpired. She screamed so loudly the neighbors called to check if everything was okay, reported Thomas, another of Jacob's childhood friends who had been at their house when the photos arrived. Jacob just sat down and put his head in his hands. I think that was the moment he realized what he'd lost, and it wasn't just the house. I took no pleasure in their distress, only a somber satisfaction that actions had consequences, and they were experiencing the natural results of their choices. The money had never been the point, only the vehicle through which their true characters had been revealed. In my new community, I deliberately sought connection rather than isolation. I joined a local book club, started taking morning walks with a group of retirees who gathered daily at the beachfront, and volunteered at the community garden. Slowly, I began building a network of new friendships, people who knew me for who I was now, not for what I owned or could provide. Among the most meaningful new connections was my volunteer work at the Cancer Support Center affiliated with the local hospital. Twice a week, I sat with patients undergoing chemotherapy, offering conversation, companionship, or simply quiet presence. I brought books, played cards, and listened to their stories, finding that in helping others through experiences similar to Eleanor's, I was healing parts of my own grief as well. "You have a gift for this," one of the nurses told me after I'd been volunteering for about 6 months. "The patients look forward to your visits. You have a calming presence." "My wife taught me how to be present during difficult times," I explained. "I'm just passing on what I learned from her." 3 months after the move, I received a letter from Jacob. Not an email or text, but a handwritten letter on proper stationery, addressed to my new home. Frank had obviously provided my address, something he wouldn't have done without my prior permission. The letter was 4 pages long, written in Jacob's distinctive handwriting that had once filled school assignments and thank-you notes for Christmas presents. It began awkwardly, with multiple crossed-out salutations, before settling on simply Dad. He wrote about the shock of discovering what I had done, the initial rage and sense of betrayal, followed by the dawning realization of how his own actions had appeared from my perspective. He described arguments with Tiffany, who remained unrepentant, insisting they had been misunderstood and that I had overreacted. Most significantly, Jacob wrote that he had begun seeing their relationship and his own choices more clearly. He described instances where he had compromised his values to please her, times he had ignored behaviors that made him uncomfortable, ways he had allowed himself to be isolated from friends and family who might have questioned the path he was taking. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he wrote toward the end. "I'm not even asking for a response. I just needed you to know that I understand what you did and why you did it." The lesson was harsh but necessary. I don't know what happens next, with you or with Tiffany, but I wanted you to know that something broke through. Whether it leads to change remains to be seen. He signed it simply Jacob, no love or familiar closing, acknowledging the distance that now existed between us. I read the letter several times, feeling a complex mixture of emotions. There was pain at the confirmation of how far we had drifted, hope at the glimmers of self-awareness, and a quiet grief for the relationship that had been damaged, perhaps irreparably. I placed the letter in my desk drawer, not yet ready to respond but unwilling to discard this tentative bridge. As weeks turned to months, I established a new rhythm to my days. Mornings began with coffee on the balcony, followed by walks along the shore. Afternoons were for volunteering or pursuing new interests I'd never had time for previously, like the digital photography class I enrolled in, inspired by Diane's powerful documentation of my departure. Evenings were sometimes solitary, with books Eleanor had loved or new ones recommended by my book club. Other nights I accepted dinner invitations from new friends, gradually building a chosen family around me. The pain of Jacob's betrayal remained, a dull ache rather than the sharp wound it had been, but it no longer defined my days. 6 months after receiving Jacob's letter, I finally wrote back, not with recriminations or detailed accounts of hurt, but with simple truths about my new life, the foundation's work, and the perspective that time and distance had provided. "The greatest loss," I wrote near the end, "wasn't the money or even the relationship we once had. It was the opportunity to share the values that truly mattered to your mother and me: integrity, compassion, and the understanding that wealth is measured in connections, not possessions. I hope you find your way back to those values, whether or not our paths cross again." I've never received a direct reply to that letter, but 3 months later, Frank forwarded me a notification. Jacob had made a modest donation to the Eleanor Morrison Memorial Foundation, with a note requesting it be directed toward the family support programs for those caring for cancer patients. It was a small gesture, perhaps, but one that suggested the lessons of consequence might have taken root in some form. I chose to see it as Eleanor would have, not as recompense or even apology, but as a tentative step toward the person our son might still become. The journey from betrayal to healing wasn't linear or complete. There were still days when grief for both Eleanor and the son I thought I knew would overwhelm me unexpectedly. But there were also moments of genuine joy, connections with new friends, purpose found in volunteer work, and a hard-won peace that came from standing firmly in my own truth. I learned that family isn't defined by blood or obligation, but by respect and love freely given. While losing my son was painful, finding my own worth again was liberating. Sometimes the family we choose brings more healing than the family we're born into, and that's a lesson worth every penny of $5 million. If you've ever had to make difficult choices about family relationships, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Was there a moment when you had to choose dignity over toxic connections? How did you rebuild after betrayal? Don't forget to like and subscribe if this story resonated with you, and share it with someone who might need to hear that sometimes the hardest boundaries are the most necessary ones. Thank you for listening. And remember, your worth is never determined by how others treat you, only by how you choose to respond.